Today I want to talk about what is known as the two-Theudas crux in the book of Acts, and this is in relation to the question of whether Luke made up speeches. A crux is something that critics talk about a lot, that they argue about a lot. And in this case, the claim is that Luke has made a mistake or a deliberate change in history in respect to making up a speech and putting words in someone's mouth in a speech that the person could not really have spoken. So it's relevant. It's very relevant to my series on whether Luke made up speeches. Now, I want to read the section of the speech. So Theudas was a revolutionary described by Josephus in Josephus' book 20. And I want to read a section of this speech of Gamaliel reported in Acts 5, where he refers to someone named Theudas. I think we can set aside the question of how Luke would have known about this particular speech or what was said in it. That's pretty easy. Paul says that he studied with Gamaliel, and so this would have been shortly after the crucifixion, and alleged by, if I'm not speaking from my conclusion that Jesus did rise, the alleged resurrection of Jesus, but that time period. So in the early 30s, and Paul could have easily had access to what Gamaliel said here, either through being actually present at the meeting or through Gamaliel telling him what he said. So Gamaliel argues for tolerance of the Christians and against the policy that the Sanhedrin is gearing up for, which is to persecute the Christians. So Acts 5, I'm going to begin at verse 35. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care what you propose to do with these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him. And he was slain, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. And so in the present case, I say to you, stay away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or action should be of men, it will be overthrown." A brief digression, the mention there of a rebellion by someone named Judas in the days of the census actually is relevant to the census crux in Luke 2, because it shows that Luke was aware of that census and approximately when it took place, and we can independently date that as AD 6. So those who say that Luke just was confused in Luke 2 about when that census took place, they need to reckon with this, because this shows that he actually knew when that census took place in AD 6, and that is apparently different from the census he's describing in Luke 2. That's a digression. So notice that Gamaliel is fairly specific, and the ordering, the after this man thing, that is there in the Greek, and he's saying that the Theudas rebellion he's talking about was put down, and that was before the Judas rebellion concerning the census. So he's dating the Theudas rebellion prior to AD 6, or what we would call AD 6. Okay, and that's going to that's going to be an important feature in our discussion. Now here's the alleged problem. The alleged problem is that when Josephus talks about a revolutionary named Theudas, that's in Antiquities 20, he's very specific and dates it in the time of the procurator two-Theudas, which would be about 44 to 46 AD. And he's really specific that the procurator two-Theudas put down the that rebellion, and that could not even be something that Gamaliel historically could have referred to in the early 30s, because it hadn't happened yet. And even more, here's Gamaliel dating his reference to a Theudas as being back, in approximately the time of the death of Herod the Great, prior to AD 6. So it would be sort of like somebody saying that Donald Trump was the president in 1976. I mean, if they are the same person, it's decades off. In fact, there were no procurators in this area in the time before AD 6. This is also a reason to think that Josephus is not wrong. One theory, and no less a scholar than Colin Hemer, is at least very open to this theory, is that Josephus is just wrong, and that Luke is correctly reporting what Gamaliel said, but that this Theudas rebelled at a different time. I don't think that's a good solution, because Josephus is very specific, and it's a completely different socio-political setting. So, but that's going to count against other theories too, and I'll be talking about that. So, in other words, they can't, if they're both talking about the same Theudas, they can't both be right. So then scholars will use this to say that Luke just made up at least this part of the speech and put this reference to Theudas anachronistically into the mouth of Gamaliel, and it can't be what Gamaliel really said. Not even by accident, since it hadn't happened at all yet. So Gamaliel couldn't have really said this at this time. Now, there are different versions of this, the extent to which someone thinks that Luke made up the speech. The version I'm going to be responding to today is found in Craig Keener's Acts commentary, and this may come as a surprise to you, but Keener's view is that Luke did have a source, that this was approximately Gamaliel's position, and he's open to the possibility that Paul was that source, that Gamaliel urged tolerance, and even that Gamaliel compared the Christians to other revolutionary movements that had come to nothing, and then said, so, don't worry about it. But he thinks that with that sort of scanty outline of approximately what Gamaliel said, and it goes on for another verse here, that Luke made up this speech otherwise and kind of fleshed it out. And in particular, Keener thinks that Luke just grabbed a couple of names of revolutionaries that he had heard of, that his audience might have heard of, Judas and Theudas, and put them into the mouth of Gamaliel in a kind of a careless way, such that he didn't really care if Gamaliel even could have said this. And maybe he knew that he couldn't have mentioned this Theudas. Maybe he didn't know, but he really didn't care because of something about ancient standards, and he would have thought it was pedantic to point out that this was historically impossible, because he was just giving illustrative examples of revolutionaries, and he heard that Gamaliel gave illustrative examples of revolutionaries, but he doesn't know who Gamaliel really mentioned, so he put a couple in his mouth, and who cares if they were, one of them at least was historically false and indeed impossible that Gamaliel could have referred to him in this speech. This is the kind of use of alleged ancient norms that I'm really opposed to. I'm sorry to have to speak this strongly, but I think this is a shallow use of the concept of ancient people did things differently, so it's all okay. As I pointed out in earlier videos, and as I point out in Chapter 7 of The Mirror or the Mask, it's much more complicated than that. And there were ancient authors who were opposed to making up speeches and thought that you needed to be more scrupulous. And moreover, I think we have specific evidence that Luke was more scrupulous than that. And he didn't just say, hey, I'm an ancient guy, so who cares? I'll just put a couple representative revolutionaries into Gamaliel's mouth. Accuracy, schmaccuracy. I really, really don't think we should just use the word ancient like that and just kind of dismiss inaccuracies. So I think that's a wrong theory. But what are our alternatives? Well, one alternative is that Luke made a good faith error and misremembered what he was told that Gamaliel said. And I make a sharp distinction between a good faith error where you really think that's what happened and, this kind of factual carelessness where you know you're making it up. And Keener does not make a sharp distinction between those. I've been studying his Acts commentary recently, and he'll just kind of mush those together as though they're both equally okay or equally problematic. I disagree. But I don't think that's a good theory either, not because I'm an inerrantist, but for this same reason of the big gap of time between the two Theudases. That it's just as it would be a surprisingly large error for Josephus to make, it's kind of a surprisingly large error for anyone to make. And I think the same would apply to, say, Paul. If Paul was Luke's source and he's remembering it years later and telling it to Luke, he would presumably know that Theudas was somebody who'd happened, more recently to his own time. Like, suppose that, Luke was telling this story to, that Paul was telling this story to Luke in 50 AD. He would know that the Theudas rebellion had happened quite recently. And so he wouldn't think that Gamaliel had referred to it as happening way back, before AD 6. So again, I don't think that the honest error theory works. But here's a very important and very interesting point. By the same token, the hey, Luke was just throwing in a couple of representative names and didn't care if they were wrong theory also doesn't work well as an explanation. Why not? Because of the specificity of Gamaliel here. So just as Josephus' specificity to a very different socio-political situation and a particular procurator argues that Josephus probably wasn't wrong, so the specificity attributed to Gamaliel here argues that Luke wasn't just being careless and just throwing in a couple of illustrative names. If you're going to do that, and you're just going to put in some names to illustrate revolutionaries, why would you put specifically into Gamaliel's mouth, A, the statement that about 400 men joined up with him? Why 400? And second, that it was after that Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census. Instead, if you were just going to throw in a couple of names and not worry about it, it would be more likely that you would just say, some time ago Theudas rose up, and he was slain, and also Judas of Galilee rose up, and he too perished. In other words, you'd leave out your specific ordering indicators and your specific numbers, like 400 men. So that doesn't fit well either. And I'm not saying this from some kind of, inerrancy stance. I'm saying that I don't think the theory of Luke's carelessly throwing in a couple of made-up names to put into Gamaliel's mouth explains the data that we have well, just as I don't think that the theory that Josephus made a mistake explains the data that we have well. And I'm not committed to, the infallibility of Josephus. I just don't think it's a good explanation. Let me point out here, too, that there's something that I have recently coined the word for. I call it perverse harmonization. I put up a post about this on Facebook. If you check my Facebook author page, you'll see that I made a similar point concerning the temple cleansing. Perverse harmonization occurs when a critic harmonizes two events that are, on the face of it, completely different events in order to accuse an author, like a biblical author, of a contradiction with some other known fact. So, even if the critic doesn't use harmonization to defend the biblical authors, sometimes they'll use a kind of harmonization to accuse them of a contradiction. Here's an example of what I mean in this case. Gamaliel says that about 400 people followed Theudas. When Josephus refers to his Theudas, which is on the face of it a completely different incident, maybe 50 years later, he says that, this vast number of people followed him. It can be translated differently. Sometimes it's translated masses followed him. Sometimes it's translated a great part of the people followed him. So it just on the face of it, it looks like more than 400. So Keener, because he's saying they're referring to the same Theudas, but that Luke just put this into Gamaliel's mouth, even though it's an anachronism, an impossibility. He says, well, Jesus had different levels, great crowds following him, and then he had the 70, and then he had the 12. So this could still be the same person. Well, that's a kind of harmonization. But you're harmonizing two things that on the face of it are completely different events. So the references to the different numbers are also, though weaker, a weak indication that they're different events. So in that sense, all of that evidence is pointing in the direction of there being different events. But the critic harmonizes, well, it could have been one person's referring to 400, another person refers to great masses, but it's still the same Theudas. Oh, but they're 50 years apart or 40-some years apart. Well, then that means that Luke is just putting an anachronism into Gamaliel's mouth. You see how that works? That's why I call it perverse harmonization. Why not just accept the fact that all of the evidence is pointing in the direction of these being two different people or two different incidents or two different events? Well, that brings us to what I think is the best explanation, not because of a commitment to inerrancy, but because I really think it has the most explanatory power here, which is that there were two different revolutionaries who went by the name of Theudas at times, and that Gamaliel really referred to one of them, and that Josephus really refers to a different one. Now, this kind of explanation where you attribute two different events, like two temple cleansings, it tends to get a lot of ridicule from critics. They're just allergic, is the way I put it, to the idea of two generally similar events. Even though when we calibrate, we find that, two different people of the same name is not so improbable. Two different generally similar events, like Jesus' protest at the temple, it's not so improbable. We get lots of similar types of events that occur in the world. And an example of similar names would be Luke's reference to Lysanias in Luke 3. And it used to be thought that he was off here and that there couldn't have been two different Lysaniases to, make him turn out to be right. And then we found an inscription that shows that independently that it looks like there was a different Lysanias, and that makes Luke come out correct in Luke 3. One was the father of the other one. So this happens way more than you would think. The argument against it is that in the documents that we have from the time, the name Theudas in just that form is low frequency. So when Keener surveys this, he's surprisingly emphatic. Sometimes Keener is a little unclear. It can be hard to figure out what he's saying. In this case, it's very clear that he recognizes and rejects the notion of there being two Theudases. He says, scholars have rejected that, and in my opinion, with good reason. He's very explicit. Well, we have kind of a clash of the titans here, because in Hemer, who's a excellent scholar of Acts, though he doesn't go with a specific view, he's kind of like leaving it open. He's very open to the two-Theudas view. I'm going to just read a footnote here on page 162 in Hemer's book. The relatively infrequent attestation of the name Theudas is misleading here, for it leaves out of account the evident abundance in informal usage both of alternative names and of hypochoristics. A hypochoristic is a shortening, like a nickname. Theudas seems to serve as the hypochoristic of many such forms as Theodotus, Theodorus, Theodotion, etc., all Greek theophoric names popular among Jews, and he gives a reference to an article. Further, in view of the great prevalence of Greek Hebrew alternative names corresponding meaning, so the meaning is given by God, Theodorus, Theodotus, etc., corresponding meaning to these theo names. Names of this type may often have served to render Jonathan, Nathaniel, Mattathias, or even Hananias, Jehohanan, and the like. A glance at the onomastics, that means names, of the Jerusalem ossuaries, burial coffins, which offer an unusually close comparison for time and place, reveal a remarkable frequency of names of these groups, whether written in Hebrew or Greek. And there's even more, to this. So what he's saying here is that the Jews often translated into Greek the meaning of a Hebrew name. So a name like Nathaniel, which means given of God, or Matthias, which can mean given by God, could be translated over to a Greek form like Theodorus or Theodosius, also meaning given by God, because it was a Greek-speaking culture. And then those Greek names were often shortened. We find shortenings, and one possible shortening, he takes to be independently plausible shortening, is Theudas. All right. Now, Peter considers this possibility, but it's very evident when you read the context. It's kind of long, so I'm not going to read it, but you can look it up. These verses in Keener's Acts commentary, his great big Acts commentary, volume 2, that he regards that as purely ad hoc. That is to say, Keener thinks that it's only supporters of the two-Theudas view who are trying to sort of save Luke from making a mistake or from putting something impossible into Gamaliel's mouth, who support that idea that Theudas is a shortening, a nickname for Theodorus, which is much more common. And he calls it valiant and ingenious. These are all indicators that he thinks it's purely ad hoc. And I've done work on ad hocness in probability theory, and so ad hocness very roughly arises when you sort of try to avoid admitting that a theory's been disconfirmed, in this case the theory that Luke didn't make up stuff in speeches, by making up something, and an indicator of that is that the thing you come up with doesn't have any good independent plausibility to it. Now, that's the point where I think Keener is wrong, and he's in that sense different from Hemer, even though Hemer doesn't, definitely advocate any one view here. Hemer clearly considers it independently plausible that more people may have been known as Theudas more than the infrequency of that exact form would seem to indicate. Another person who I think seems to regard that as having independent plausibility is Richard Bauckham. Now, Bauckham, I haven't been able to find commenting on this specific passage, but in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he has a lot of talking about names, and he specifically lists Theudas as a alternative, or a shortening for Theodorus. It's right there in one of his charts. He's got, Theodorus here and the Theudas here in the columns, okay? And he just doesn't even comment on it. Malcolm's very interested in shortenings. That's just like one of his things. So he's similarly interested in where does the name Thaddeus come from? What might that be a modification of? Or the name Thomas. I think he even does this with, non-biblical sources as well. So he might very well regard Theudas as a shortening of Theodorus, even in Josephus. Okay? And Theodorus is more common. And if you also include, or Theodotus, Theodosius, or Nathaniel, Matthias, and so forth, now we're multiplying what are called probabilistic resources. So, first of all, I don't think that Keener is recognizing that this has independent plausibility. This isn't just being brought up to save Luke's face. And then secondly, he comes back, when Keener's arguing against the two-Theudas possibility, he comes back to this idea of, but it's such a coincidence that you have two guys named Theudas who are both revolutionaries. Like, wow, that would be really quite a coincidence. But what he doesn't recognize is that once you see it as plausible, and you see that it is independently plausible, that this is a shortening for a wide variety of other possible names, then it's not just such a coincidence anymore. The person that Gamaliel's referring to, for all we know, could have been originally named Matthias, while the guy whom Josephus is talking about could have originally been named Jonathan or Theodorus, okay? And then they might just have been spoken of by certain people as Theudas. Okay, and so it's not such a great coincidence anymore because you have this large number of other possible original names that are far higher in frequency in our records than Theudas specifically. And so if you're going to keep coming back to golly what a coincidence, you need to grapple with this name issue a little more deeply. Now, as I say, I think we need to recognize that the specificity of the texts really cuts against all theories of mistake, deliberate invention, deliberate wanton carelessness on the part of Luke. Like, I'm just going to throw in a couple of names that people might have heard of. Those are really all disconfirmed by the specificity here. If you were going to make up a speech and set it in the year, let's say, 2015, maybe you would carelessly have somebody refer to Donald Trump as president a little bit earlier. But what you wouldn't do, if you were just being careless, would be to have somebody say, and Donald Trump was president in 1976. And after that, Bill Clinton was president. Like, if you're going to make up a speech, you're not going to make it that implausible. There's no role to be served by that degree of implausibility created by that degree of specificity. So I think we need to recognize that the theory that Luke is making something up here and not caring about accuracy doesn't explain the data very well. This is one of the biggest examples that is given of Luke supposedly making things up. I also want to mention here, in Josephus 17, concerning the time of right after the death of Herod the Great, which is what it appears Gamaliel's referring to here with Theudas. He says there were many rebellions. He gives a sample, Josephus gives a sample of like 4. Okay, but he has this hyperbole. There were 10,000 disturbances at this time. And he says that whenever anybody set himself up as a robber baron, then his followers would declare him to be king. Okay, now he doesn't mention anyone named Theudas at that time, but he's just giving a sample. So that's another reason to think that it's actually independently plausible that there was another guy who had some other name, who could have been known as Theudas, who was one of these, 10,000 disturbances. Again, that's independent evidence from Josephus 17 that places this into a plausible, independently plausible historical context. Josephus only names a few at that point, so he's not trying to give you an exhaustive list. Gamaliel only names 2. He's clearly not trying to give an exhaustive list. And the Theudas, he names only at about 400, he says, followers, so he's not even necessarily, the most dangerous. So when you've got such small samples, it's not a good argument to say that Gamaliel's list needs to be a proper subset of the ones we find, the revolutionaries we find named anywhere in Josephus. That's just not a good way to reason. So I think we need to just be much more careful. And we need to not be throwing around the, hey, ancient people thought it was fine to make up speeches thing so quickly, so casually, and without digging in more into the argumentative structure and the probabilistic structure here of arguments that actually show that Luke is very accurate. The cautious way that Hemer puts it is that Luke has a lot of credit from his accuracy elsewhere, and so we shouldn't be hasty to accuse him of an error. And then he just kind of doesn't decide. I think I would say right now that the two-Theudas view is actually well out in front, all things considered, as an explanation of all of the evidence, both in Josephus and in Acts. And you'll notice that, again, this saves Josephus from making an error just as much as it saves Luke from making an error or being careless. So it's not a religiously motivated conclusion that I'm drawing here. If this content is of value to you, please recommend this, please recommend this broadcast either in its video, YouTube form, or in its audio form. We're quickly catching up to the backups of this to Anchor FM, and thanks again to Eric Manning for his help with that. And hopefully pretty soon we'll actually be all caught up, so this will just be going out week after week in both forms, which I'm just really excited about. So please be sure to like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.